Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to tune in to Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, September 23rd, 2023. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka, riding the waves of history, giving us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. Then, we'll be queuing up a powerful clip from President Mamadi Doumbouya of Guinea, who's addressing the general debate of the 78th session of the General Assembly at the United Nations in New York this past week. After that, author, historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne will be joined on the line by Andrei Popoviciu, journalist in Senegal and author of a recent featured investigation of African migration to Europe found in this Chicago-based journal In These Times. Then, in the second half of our program, Prison Radio will be sending us yet another relay, bringing us a message from our dear brother behind the walls, Baba Mumia Abu Jamal, who has a message about the MOVE organization and their presence in film. Finally, we'll be hearing from Louis Miles, a graduate student at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor and a researcher in the experiences of African Americans in Mexico. He's on the horn with Dr. Gerald Horne, discussing the context and findings of his research of a lesser-known population, and you won't want to miss it, so stay tuned. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org on the web. To make sure that we stay on the smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring The Dells, Grant Green, Cyrus Chestnut, Ben Patterson, Gary Burton, and the Alvin Queen Trio. Now people get ready for this train a-coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a speech from Ghanaian President Mamadi Doumbouya. Then a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Andrei Popoviciu right here on Freedom Now.
Up is man that found that wisdom, and with that get overstanding. and knowledge shall be added unto thee. On your way up, be good to those people you met, so you could have meet the same people.
Molweni Ekai. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of Tuesday, September 26th. This presentation will highlight significant progressive revolutionary activists and events in the struggle for humanity and spirituality over greed and the ruling class. September 28, 1958, Guinea, West Africa votes no, not only to French colonialism, but votes no to any economic and political ties to France, thereby proclaiming a complete independence from European rule. This mass decision set in motion the development of the most revolutionary African microstate in Africa, laying the groundwork for the development of Pan-Africanism as an objective and ideology of Nkrumahism to Tourism. September 29, 1965. CIA and its puppets overthrow the progressive democratic government in Indonesia of Sukarno and murder over 500,000 people. Indonesia composes of over 18,110 islands and is the world's largest Muslim country, targeted due to its multitude of natural resources. September 30th, 1975, the military dictatorship called the Derg declares a state of emergency and seizes control over the Ethiopian government, imprisoning His Majesty Haile Selassie Jah and slaughtering students, intellectuals, and trade unionists, ending the longest rule of an emperor in Africa. October 1st, 1949. China, one of the poorest and most divided countries in the world, is liberated under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. After 30 years of armed struggle, thereby liberating women, peasants, and working class from centuries of stagnant development. October 2nd, 1800. Nat Turner was born the week before Gabriel Prosser, a well-known rebellious slave leader, was hanged. Nat Turner, a gifted child, believed that God spoke to him directly and commanded him to lead African people to destroy the system of slavery. Nat Turner used religion as a weapon of revolution. October 2nd, 1858, Queen Mary Thomas, was born. She was an African slave rebellion leader in St. Croix, which is part of the U.S. colony in the Virgin Islands today. On October 1st, 1878, she and two other slave women, Rebecca Frederick and Exeline Solomon, aka the Black Amazon, led a revolt and killed many whites and set fire to the plantation houses of white slave owners, which also freed many slaves. October 3rd, 1952. The Mau Mau Rebellion against the British colonial rule in Kenya, East Africa begins. The Mau Mau's major targets were African collaborators with the British, thus beginning the class struggle, which has intensified throughout Africa and the diaspora. The Mau Mau correctly understood that without collaborationists, England could not maintain colonial rule. October 3rd, 1904. The people of Namibia, formerly called Southwest Africa, begin armed struggle against German colonial rule, evolving into total liberation under the leadership of Southwest African People's Organization. This has been Freedom Now at 90.7 FM in Southern California, 98.7 FM in Central California. Freedom Now's mission statement and profile is on the web at kpfk.org under programs. We hope that these reminders of bygone struggle will motivate those in the listening audience not to get frustrated with the slow pace of change. We have a rich history of struggle that has moved world society forward. We appreciate your participation in the upcoming fund drive, October 10th to 22nd. We would like to have a unity chant of Amandla Awetu, which means all power to the people. So join us as we chant Amandla in response Awetu. Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu.
nous mettre sous la coupe
Placing
de telle
us
ou telle puissance
under the influence of this or that
est une
power
insulte,
is an insult.
du mépris
It is contempt and racism
vis-à-vis d'un continent
towards a
de
continent
plus d'1,3 milliard
of more than
millions de
1,3 billion people.
Il est important dans cette
It is important
prestigieuse et influente assemblée
that in this prestigious and influential assembly, we understand
que
clearly,
l'Afrique des papas
definitively,
La vieille
that
Afrique
the era
s'est terminée.
of the old Africa is over.
Époque déséquilibrée
This is the end
Injuste.
of an
où nous
unbalanced,
n'avons pas
an
droit
unjust era
au chapitre.
where we had no say in
C'est
the
le
matter.
moment
Africa,
où
ladies
un
and
modèle de
gentlemen,
gouvernance
is suffering from a governance
nous a
model
été imposé.
that has been imposed on it.
Un modèle certes
Through my
la
short
gestion
but
d'un
very
État,
intense
la Guinée,
experience of managing a state,
j'ai mieux
Guinea,
mesuré
I have
à quel
come
point
to better understand the
ces modèles
extent
a surtout
to which this
contribué
model has, above
à
all,
entretenir
contributed to
un
maintaining
système d'exploitation
a system
et
of
de pillage de nos
exploitation
ressources
and
par les
plunder
autres,
of our resources by others,
et une corruption très active
and
de nos élites,
a rampant corruption of our
des
elites.
leaders nationaux, c'est de prendre en compte nos droits,
It is
de nous
time
donner notre
to take
place.
our rights into account and
Mais
to let
aussi
us
et
take our
surtout,
proper place, but also and
le
above
moment
all, it is
d'arrêter
time
de nous faire de la leçon,
to stop lecturing
de nous
us
prendre de haut,
and to stop
d'arrêter de nous traiter comme des enfants.
treating us with condescension like children.
Rassurez-vous, rassurez-vous, nous
Rest
sommes
assured
suffisamment grands pour savoir ce
that
qui
we're
est
old
bien
enough
et ce qui est bon pour nous.
to know what is good for us.
Nous sommes suffisamment matures pour
We are
définir
mature
nos
enough
priorités,
to define our priorities,
pour concevoir notre modèle
to design
qui
our own
correspond
models,
à
which
notre
are in line
identité,
with our identity,
à la réalité de nos populations,
the daily reality
à ce que nous sommes
of
tout
our countries and
simplement.
our populations, in line with what we
Nous vous
are,
serions
quite simply.
fort reconnaissants
This
et du plus mauvais
infantilization
effet
that we have
pour
experienced
une jeunesse africaine
has had
qui s'est émancipée.
the worst effects on African youth who are now
Dans ce contexte,
emancipated.
nous sommes tous interpellés. La communauté internationale
The
doit
international
regarder
community
l'Afrique
must
avec
look
les yeux
to
neufs.
Africa with new eyes.
Elle doit entreprendre avec elle
It must now
désormais une
engage
coopération franche
in genuine cooperation
dans
with
un esprit de
Africa
partenariat gagnant
in a
gagnant.
spirit of
Je
win-win
vous remercie
partnership.
de votre attention.
I thank you for your
Merci.
attention. Thank you.
For Pacifica Radio Los Angeles, KPFK, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is Andrei Popoviciu, a journalist in Senegal and author of an investigation of African migration to Europe in a recent issue of the Chicago-based journal in These Times. Welcome to Freedom Now Los Angeles, Andrei Popoviciu.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this article?
So I moved from Europe to Senegal about a year ago with the intention on domestic issues and on political issues, but to look into influence in West Africa, including in Senegal, but more broadly in the region. And I wanted to look at the Union, namely its investments in migration projects, in achievement, and also in the unintended consequences they might have in the region. So the reason why I wanted to look into a lot of funding, a lot of EU taxpayer money going to Africa, which is so far away from Europe. How is that being spent, and actively impacting the human rights situation there? So that reason.
Mm-hmm. So, what is the universal forensic extraction device? And the audience should know that I understand the FBI in the United States uses the same device.
A tool created by Israeli software company Cellbrite, which capable of extracting information from someone's phone after it's being plugged in. So it can extract anything from messages, deleted photos, a lot of multimedia data, and so on. So it can take all this data, even if it was deleted, and the agencies can use it for their investigations, criminal investigations. During the course of my reporting, I found that EU money has buy this same device, and French EU policemen have also been deployed to train Senegalese border officials into mainly to investigate and criminalize the movement of migrants, but also people in the region, with the stated aim of preventing migration from. So it's a tool used by authorities there, bought with EU money, in order to people, migrants, moving and crossing that specific border, the Senegalese, and figuring out who is facilitating the movements in order to them and criminalize these movements.
What did you witness at the border crossing between Senegal and Mauritania?
The specific border crossing is a very important one because it's one of going up north from Senegal towards Mauritania, Morocco, and eventually towards Spain. And I visited a police station, a border. The police officers there were all geared up with a bunch of these surveillance technology, invasive. But the most interesting thing was that they were all paid by EU money, right? And it basically gave them capabilities of surveilling the land there through drones. We have the UFPD device that we mentioned, a bunch of other types of technologies that they have a high possibility of violating the rights of people on the move, of citizens, and so on. So it's a very interesting place where there's a lot of travel. Traditionally, people used to travel, but in recent years, with pressure from the EU, there's been an increasing effort to scrutinize path crossings more and do more border checks for the stated aim of preventing people from reaching Europe.
Mm-hmm. So what is the National Division for the Fight Against Migrant Trafficking and Related Practices?
So this is another institute in which the EU has pumped millions of euros to equip and train authorities to prosecute and prevent migration towards Europe. The French are extremely involved in this, providing trainings. So the phone extractor was also bought with this money, and it was specifically to this specific unit. So it's a unit with the help of the EU, funded by the EU, to push the authorities there to criminalize movement and migration more, people from reaching Europe. But the bigger issue is be used on local populations. Could they be misused? Are there any impact assessments before sending these technologies and these trainings to South Africa? And the answer is no. I found that there is no such precautions being taken. Through the creation of this unit and equipping it with no regard for human rights, these technologies can be misused locally and offensive migrants, but also the rights of citizens and the Senegalese.
So, what is biometric fingerprinting and facial recognition software, and why is the latter so problematic when surveying darker skinned faces?
So are kind of tools, digital tools that collect extremely sensitive, that includes fingerprinting, as you said, facial recognition, iris scans, extremely sensitive data that is very specific to each individual. The issue is about collecting all this data and putting it in database, cross over into other types of databases. For example, if you have a database for you cross-reference it or you merge it with a database for criminal activity, you have high chances of this data being abused and misused. These to crack down on dissidents, human rights activists, or criminal. And beyond these risks, there's also very researched fact that a lot of these technologies have been the algorithms, a lot of the kind of research and the way they've been set to people. So they don't work very well on people of color, and they even be able to reach their stated goal of identifying people, organizing the biometric data in these databases. These types of things are present in Senegal, but not only, across the region, and a lot by EU taxpayer money, and are again a sort of human rights impact assessments or any thought of what could be an unintended consequence when they're used.
What is Frontex and why has it been criticized so sharply?
So Frontex, an EU agency, the EU's best funded agency, and it deals with, it's the EU's Border and Coast Guard agency. So it pools officers and border EU countries and creates this kind of overlapping force unit or agency that doesn't have a lot of power with individual countries to their presence, so they always have to go through the national authorities, to the national border guards, but it has a lot of money, national border authorities. And in Europe, it's been embroiled in a series of scandals over the past 10 years, which is increasing of its budget, which is somewhere around over 300 million euros. So the agency has been accused by a lot of independent reports, by journalists, UN, investigations of facilitating human rights violations, so be it migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, trying to reach Europe, either in the Mediterranean, but also through the routes in Europe. They would not giving them the right to be processed and the right to try in international law and the national laws of most countries and the issue is that for the first time, for all these negative events that have happened, he was forced to quit his job as the director of Frontex. And now the EU wants to send Frontex to countries like Senegal, so Mauritania, to deploy European border guards from Frontex to patrol in West Africa, again to prevent people from crossing. So the fear is that on Europe's doorstep will go unnoticed, happening so far away from the borders of the European Union. And is indeed it could be a threat to rights of people living in the region.
So what is Operation HERA, H-E-R-A?
So Frontex was deployed outside of the EU, outside of Europe, of the continent. Around 2006, there was a surge of people crossing Senegal and going to the Canary Islands, which belong to Spain, but are close to the West African coast, and very close to Morocco specifically. There was a surge of boats, somewhere around between 30 and 40,000 boats ended up departing that year. So the EU decided to send in the Frontex from the waters, the West African coast, together with the Spanish. This operation was the first time Frontex was deployed. It was very and untransparent. No one really knew what happened, but they claimed the amount of boats departing towards Europe, towards the Canary Islands, a sign of what is called the externalization of border control. The externalization of border control from Europe to Africa, and it showed how a deployment like that could be. But what Frontex is seeking now to achieve, and the type of it wants, goes far beyond what happened in 2006 with Operation HERA.
Finally, sir, talk to us about how imperialism created conditions for so many Africans seeking to flee their homeland in the first place in search of a better life in the European Union, and remind us of the countless stories of Africans drowning in the choppy seas between Africa and the EU, particularly in reference to St. Louis, Senegal, not St. Louis, Missouri, my hometown, but St. Louis, Senegal.
Yeah, so it is very clear that Islam and the empires that colonized the majority of the African continent, in West Africa, the French and the British, they had a huge impact. So let's remember, about 50 years ago, Senegal specifically, for example, it gained its independence, colonial administration, and the continues to exist. France prints the currency of most franc, which is printed in France. There's countless and countless businesses and resource extraction in West Africa. So mining and literally extracting the resources that people there could benefit from. And then even they closed the deal about 20 years ago with Senegal, which has been renewed both in Senegal and Mauritania, in which it allows European commerce to fish in Senegalese waters. And when I visited the northern town of Senegal called Saint Louis, again named after the former Louis XIV, that was this dynamic was very apparent, because you have a centuries-old tradition of fishing, through which is sustaining their lives through fishing. But then you have all these eels coming there and taking all the fish, leaving artisanal fishermen depleting all the fish stocks and leaving them with nothing to earn their living. A lot of these kind of extractive industries from Europe, but also from across the world and in other places of the world, they're really forcing people. They end up having no way to sustain themselves because these are being crushed by these skewed trade agreements and, by
Mhm. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Andrei Popoviciu, journalist based in Senegal, author of an investigation of African migration to Europe in a recent issue of the Chicago-based journal In These Times. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
Remembering Move on film and in life. How do we remember Move? Well, it depends on how we met them or first learned about them. By that I mean, what form of media did you consume to learn about Move? If you read local papers at the time, you probably detested Move, for the papers did their level best to dehumanize Move, and in fact, to demonize them. But if you viewed the film Move, Confrontation in Philadelphia, I bet you had a more nuanced and perhaps more positive point of view, for the film allowed Move people to speak their own minds. And once it got banned by Temple University, I resolved to liberate it and let the people of the city see it in its entirety. And when people, regular people, saw the film, it blew them away. For here were Move people, not just in brief sound bites, but in extended discussions, giving their ideas, insights, and arguments. In a word, the film humanized Move. The film broke through the demonization imposed by the local press and helped build support for the Move organization and their fight for freedom. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, and with me on the line is Louis Miles, a graduate student at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, presently researching the experience of Black Americans in Mexico. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, Louis Miles.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Dr. Horne.
And thank you for joining us. So, why and how did you embark on this project?
Thank you for that question. I really got started on this research in Mexico and studying Black Americans in Mexico really randomly. But there's a particular orientation for how I ended up in this general area. I originally wanted to study African Americans moving to Ghana because I went to Ghana in 2018. And I remember going with a group and traveling between Kumasi and Accra, and we stopped halfway through And I met a woman who was from Chicago, Illinois, and said she had been in Accra, Ghana. And that was kind of like the first time I had interacted really with someone who was not a traveler or just a tourist, but had made a substantial move. And she said she had been in Ghana for about 7 years. And so I originally envisioned a project in studying African Americans moving to Ghana. But with pandemic limitations and the second year and just my general kind of orientation towards studying those in the Americas, I ended up in Mexico. And so my general area is in focusing on African Americans and how they envision different places around the world, right? Whether that was to Liberia, to Haiti, to Cuba, how African Americans and US-born Black people envisioned Brazil as a racial paradise in the early 1900s and late 1800s. So this general area or intellectual area of studying African Americans and how they envisioned home, racial paradise, or just more economic or political opportunities outside the United States. And so Mexico fits squarely into that dialogue. And I just happened to pick an area that didn't have as much contemporary work in it. And so far, I've really been surprised by some of the findings and really intrigued by the relationship between African Americans in Mexico today.
So, what are your main findings so far? And as you answer, give us an idea of the universe, the numbers of people we're talking about, and the time frame.
Yeah. So one of the things I'll start with is in 2020, Mexico included a question or several questions about Afro-descendants broadly in their country. So this is the first time that Mexico ever did a national count of people of African descent in its nation state, right? And from that data, we know that there's roughly a calculated 11,000, just over 11,000 people who identify as Afro descent from the United States, right? So those would be African Americans from the United States who are living in Mexico, right? Who are foreign born from the United States but are living in Mexico. But of course, as we know, census data is often an undercount, right? And it doesn't always capture people who obviously don't take the census, people who live in Mexico or have lived in Mexico for a long period of time, but aren't necessarily on any national register. And there's also a lot of Black folks who go between the United States on a tourist visa and not necessarily are full-time residents. So that number misses a lot of what I think to be probably an undercount in some of the other dynamics, right? The other aspect I would say is that most Black folks from the United States are occupied in probably about 5 major areas. Mérida in the Yucatan, Guadalajara, Mexico City, Mazatlan, and Oaxaca City, right? So most occupy major or medium-sized metropolises, not necessarily rural areas where they would interact with more Afro-Mexicanos or Afro-Mexicans, but mostly major areas such as Mexico City, Guadalajara, I would say also Playa del Carmen. So I spent a year traveling to some of these places and doing interviews with several people. And so I must say a place like Mérida has become a hub for Black families in particular, right? There was a time, as one of my participants says, they would be surprised to see another Black person from the United States. But now it is no surprise. And there's many communities emerging and have been for quite some time now.
So by the way, how did you learn how to speak Spanish?
So I took 2 classes at my liberal arts college at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. But, you know, as they say, if you don't use it, you lose it. And aside from taking those classes, I had no opportunities really to speak Spanish on a day-to-day basis. So I would say most of my fluency now comes from living and navigating Mexico as a solo traveler, as a researcher, and then the classes I've taken since I've been in Mexico. I think it's just easier to learn Spanish when you're there. You hear it, you get the context, you're forced to speak it. So it's a very different learning experience, and it kind of builds your confidence because you have to do it.
Now, one of the more notorious, shall we say, Black American exiles in Mexico, south of the border, was William Ellis, roots in Texas, migrates more than a century ago, and actually winds up spending time in what is now Ethiopia, trying to work out various Pan-African projects. Talk to us about Ellis and some of the more notorious Black American exiles south of the border.
Yeah, so Ellis, and I'll talk about Jack Johnson as well. Ellis, of course, was born on the, if I recall correctly, really the cusp of the end of slavery, right? In the borderlands between Texas and the United States, right? And so in Ellis's mind, there was an opportunity to be a businessman, to be an entrepreneur, and to navigate, as a businessman, a place, an arena without the boundaries and the racial barriers that obviously confronted him in the United States, right? And so in his time in Mexico, he became a millionaire, right? Through a variety of business ventures, many particular investments around land, around property, around the production of certain goods. And so really, when we think about Ellis, I envision him and understand him as a man who saw opportunity and want to cross boundaries and barriers. Mexico was a place for him to do that in ways that he could not do so in his homeland.
Mm-hmm. And you said you were going to say a word or two about Jack Johnson.
Yes. So Jack Johnson is also one of an important figure, I think, in this conversation, right? When we think about how African Americans and U.S.-born Blacks envision Mexico, right? And so Johnson, as you spoke on your earlier podcast, was under fire for having intercourse with a white woman. And so he was in flight, in particular from U.S. law, and as a infamous boxer, there was a particular interest in prosecuting and persecuting and using him as an example. And so Jack Johnson escaped to Mexico, but also used Mexico as a space to promote and think about Mexico as a site for other people in the United States to move to, right? We think about the ads that he took out in newspapers promoting the purchase of land and buying property in Mexico and moving to Mexico, right? So in many respects, he was a propagandist of moving to Mexico, right? And a proponent of immigration to the southern nation. Of course, as the president and the national makeup of Mexico changed and the conditions in which he arrived shifted, Johnson knew his time in Mexico had to come to an end. He eventually surrendered and did a year and 1 day of a prison sentence. But aside from that, I still think both Ellis and Johnson represent a question, an element around Black visions, around mobilities, and how Black folks in the United States see opportunities even beyond borders and boundaries, and how they go about pursuing them, right?
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about the gendered experience of this Black American exile community. Are there differences between how women and men have experienced Mexico?
Yes. I really like that question. I would say off the bat that even in my very sample size, there's a gender disparity, right? There's most of my participants and most of the people I interview and most of the people I interact with in Mexico from the United States, particularly Black people from the United States, are women, right? Which is particularly interesting to me because if we look at the history of immigration movements and we look at particularly movements in the late 1800s and early 1900s, most of the people who promoted moving out of the country were men. It was a particularly masculinist movement, right? Aside from speakers like Marianne Chedd, we think about Martin Delaney, we think about Marcus Garvey, we can think about Alexander Crummell, like all of the major proponents of moving outside the United States were men, right? And so in my research, I find it interesting and intriguing that most of the promotion of moving to Mexico, even if you just do a search on YouTube, is Black women. It's Black women who are speaking about moving to the country, Black women taking sabbatical years, Black women taking some reprieve or refuge from the racial hostility and racial violence and gendered racial violence that they experience in the United States, in the workplace, and so forth, and moving to Mexico and promoting those ideas, particularly through social media. And so most of my participants are women, are Black women, right? And what I find also interesting is Black women's particular organization around Mexico, not just in Mexico City or Guadalajara, but also, medium-sized places like Mazatlan and Oaxaca City, in that Black women are organizing particular groups. They're the ones who are organizing meetups. They're facilitators of this migration, right? So when people say, hey, like, I want to move to Mexico, how do I do it? Often it is Black women who are answering those questions and doing a lot of the organizing work around moving. Black men are not necessarily invisible, but they're just not as present in the same amount of numbers, right? And I think of that for a variety of reasons. I think Black men, based on my observations, choose some other destinations to go to, particularly nations in Asia, such as Thailand or Colombia, if we stick to the Americas, right? And so Black men have a place, but I would say definitely from my observations, the gender makeup is mostly women, right? And it's mostly single Black women in particular, and single Black women with children. And so there are places like Merida where there are a lot of families, and there are Black men, especially with their families, and have done kind of like a family unit migration. But by and large, it's a lot of Black women. And I think that's an interesting spin on what we understand migration in the contemporary to look like.
Any further reflection on this disparity? I mean, why is there a difference? You said Black men often can be found in Colombia, not necessarily as big a number as Mexico. Why is that? Yes,
I will back up a little bit and talk about travel and migration in general. When we talk about moving to another country, it requires one to have the economic resources or the job opportunities to sustain oneself unless they get a job in another country. And so we know that Black men in the United States often work jobs that require in-person labor, right? That are not remote teaching positions or remote, positions such as account executives or account managers, all the things that people do online. Black men are often in jobs that require in-person participation and in-person action, right? Such as delivery drivers, even teaching in person, like all of these things, right? And so that is something that's come up in my observations when I ask, people why they didn't move or where are Black men. And often it's an economic, right? It's an economic factor, even having the privilege of having a job to live and work remotely. And that is not necessarily something that when we look at the larger trends and larger disparities in the United States when it comes to educational opportunities in what job sectors Black men are in and are in for a sustained period of time, does not permit working and living in Mexico. And to that point, based on migration to Mexico, one cannot take up jobs that one can easily see Mexicans taking, right? That's based on Mexican immigration law, right? Like a car shop or a repair shop, a car repair shop, can't necessarily hire a foreigner and sustain employment of a foreigner if there is an equal or competent Mexican potential employee, right? So there's a lot of limitations on what jobs people can even obtain and have that is particularly gendered, right? And so when it comes to the other destinations, Mexico's not cheap. Mexico's not, I never even advanced the idea that Mexico is cheap, right? But when it comes to geo arbitrage, which is this idea of extending the US dollar and using US dollars to make, increase in life and living conditions, money can go much further in other places other than Mexico. And so there's Black men that I've met that were traveling through Mexico, but decided and told me that it would cost less to live in Colombia, it costs less to live in places such as Indonesia, Taiwan. And so I think that also contributes to the gender disparity. So it's economic in a larger sense, not so much cultural or some pathological idea that Black men choose differently. It's not that. I think it is mostly structural that manifests in people's decisions at the meso level.
What about the southern neighbor of San Diego County in Los Angeles, speaking of Tijuana? Any reflections on that town?
Yes. Migrations between Tijuana and San Diego have gone on since the very inception of, both republics. And of course, California was once part of Mexico, right? And so in the historical sense, the ties have always been there, right? Because they were, of course, one nation, and there was not a border between San Diego and Tijuana. Now, we know that there are people who travel between the border every day, right? And live in Tijuana and work in San Diego, right? And so I have a few participants that decided to participate in my study, and I got to speak with them, and they just found living in Mexico representative of a better quality of life for them. They enjoyed the pace of living, the access, and just fundamentally could not afford living in California. And so there's a lot of economic ties between the two cities, and I think it's going to proceed at least for the foreseeable future. What that looks like in terms of U.S.-Mexican relations, what it looks like in terms of border control, I think those will continue to unfold. But for now, we understand and continue to see daily hundreds, even thousands of people who go between the border every day for work and living.
Finally, Lewis Miles, graduate student at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, researching the experience of Black American exiles in Mexico. We know that next year in our southern neighbor, there will be a very important election. And I'm wondering if you have any reflections on the voting patterns, to the extent that they're citizens, of course, of these Black Americans south of the border. Are they supportive of the incumbent, AMLO, Manuel Lopez Obrador, or the historic party of the 20th century, the PRI, the party of the institutionalized revolution, or the conservative newcomer, PAN?
I would say, one, when I started this project, I didn't originally envision collecting data on the political attitudes or ideologies of my participants for two reasons. One, most of my participants are not Mexican citizens. I have only a few that are Mexican citizens. And when I say Mexican citizens, they have the ability to vote and participate in political activity. Aside from that, it's actually prohibited and banned for foreigners to engage in Mexican politics, right? And that's a carryover of the Mexican Revolution, right? Is the prohibition of foreigners being involved in Mexican electoral politics, certainly voting, and even to some extent certain protest engagement, it is explicitly written that foreigners are prohibited from participating in. That said, I think, and I understand my participants to think of Mexico as an ideal place and wonderful place to live, but it doesn't have it is not a place without problems, right? Without deep inequities, without major violence against women, against trans women, against femme people. It's a country that is not paradise, right? Despite the promotions of Cancun, right? And so I would say my participants definitely think of a more progressive candidate and are thinking about policies that affect the cities that they live in and the regions that they occupy. And so I don't think there's necessarily anyone leaning in overly vocal support, but I think, and I know that my participants think very deeply about the everyday factors that will affect them, that affect how they move through a city like Mexico City, how they move through the country and what's permitted in the larger economy, and the relations between Mexico and the United States, right? That is the entry point, is particularly which candidate and by what terms and under what conditions do they see a relationship between the United States, its northern neighbor, and really largely the Caribbean and the other major nations in the Americas and South and Central America.
Well, Lewis Miles, graduate student at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with journalist Andrei Popoviciu. Visit inthisetimes.com today and find his feature investigation today. Next up, we'd like to thank Lewis Miles from the University of Michigan for sharing his research with us today. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Thank you to Prison Radio for yet another relay from our dear brother Mumia Abu Jamal. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Baba Didan Kamati. Shout out to our sister Liliana Kaboko on the African Drumbeat historical calendar for the week. Shout out to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of you loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to Freedom Now and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for a revolution.